Hello and welcome or welcome back. If you are new to this channel, my name is Jen, and today, if you're a regular subscriber to my channel, a little bit more of a serious talk. I do have a playlist on my channel called Real Talk. I've been through a lot in my life, and one of my main passions is just to be able to share from that experience to try to help others either going through the same thing or something similar. So when I come across different things that I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's so good, and I wish I would have read this several years ago, my desire is just to get it out there so that others can benefit from it as well. Just a little bit of background, and I'll link these videos down below. I've shared my story. I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and celebrating recovery a couple of years now from a 15-year porn addiction. So quite the ride through life thus far. And there's a group that I follow, and it's called Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. If you're not familiar with this group, I highly recommend following them. This is one of those groups that when I first heard one of their speakers talk, I was like, oh my goodness. Because you go through life, when you face like certain kinds of trauma, you go through life just knowing like so many people just don't get it, right? It's not that they don't want to, it's just, and when I heard their speakers, I'm like, oh my gosh, like they get it. And I felt understood like in half a second. So anyway, they had posted this on actually Facebook this morning. It says, if you are a survivor of abuse who has been spiritually hurt and is reluctant, even afraid to return to church, you are not alone. Your church can provide significant healing by helping to foster meaningful spiritual connections for those who have been abused. Your church can also inflict great spiritual injury on those who have experienced the trauma of abuse. Whew. So this is actually something I've been dealing with these last several years. And again, like I finally found my healing and recovery a couple years ago, but at that same time, there was just like this shift, and clash, with the church that I was attending, and so much heartbreak and confusion over it. And I read this and I'm like, I get it. So it shares an article, and I will link this article down below in the description, by Victor Veith, called Returning to Church After Abuse. Now my abuse did happen within a church setting when I was 12 years old, and it was the assistant youth pastor. But I've never stopped going to church. Church continued on even when I went to college, got involved with the church, got married, into an adulthood, still continuing to go to church. So it's not like I was outside of the church walls, but even within the church walls, when you've been through trauma, I'm learning now the importance of finding a church, and I don't want to say like equipped for your trauma. Many churches, to be honest, like they're not going to be equipped. But you can't be clashing. Like you gotta be on the same page, if that makes sense. And we'll talk more about that as we go through this here. I'm just going to read through this article here. Help for survivors of child abuse to return to church and begin their spiritual healing. Caution to sensitive readers. This article discusses several child abuse cases. I don't remember all the names of the children whose cases I've handled in my career as a child abuse prosecutor. There are, though, myriad images that haunt me. The image of a girl who, when asked how she broke her collarbone, took a doll and flung it across the room with all her might. That, she said, is what Daddy did to me. The image of a young man who, when asked how he could be sure he was 12 the first time his father sold him as a prostitute, responded simply, "You never forget the day your childhood ends." The image of a girl who entered a crowded courtroom only to see multiple church elders and both her pastors lined up to support the father who sodomized her. Upon witnessing this spectacle, the girl tugged on my suit and whispered in my ear, "Does this mean that God is against me too?" These children and a million more like them are the shadow children of our country. Boys and girls, younger and younger, who from the corners of their rooms ask, "Is it safe to come out now?" For many abused children, though, there is a deeper question, a question reflected in the words of the girl wondering if God was against her. The girl and so many others within the faith community are asking, is it safe to go back to church? Maybe you're also asking this question. If you are a survivor of abuse who has been spiritually hurt and is reluctant or even afraid to return to church, you are not alone. According to dozens of studies involving more than 19,000 abused children, a large number of maltreated children have not only been injured physically and emotionally, but also spiritually. This may happen because religion was incorporated into the abuse of a child. A child may have prayed that the abuse stop and wonders why a God who can part seas and raise the dead choose not to stop beatings, rape, starvation, and other atrocities. Many survivors of abuse report that when they have reached out to clergy or spiritual leaders, they are ignored or even further abused by the very people whom they seek protection. I once spoke with a man whose father beat him and regarded the proverb "spare the rod" as his personal life verse and a license to cause lasting physical and emotional damage. What most troubled this man, though, was the response of his pastor. He said he tried to explain his childhood to his pastor only to be told he needed to focus primarily on his own sinful inability to forgive and forget. Yet, like physical and emotional injuries, with time, spiritual injuries can heal as well. When survivors are able to find a meaningful spiritual connection, studies find they also cope better physically and emotionally. If you're struggling with the question of whether or not to return to church, you may want to speak with a mental health professional well-versed in the dynamics of child abuse and the impact of maltreatment on spirituality. If you have someone in your faith community you can trust, this person may also be able to guide you. Adult survivors who have returned to church often tell me they follow two simple rules: avoid churches that hurt and seek churches that help. One survivor of sexual abuse told me that she had repeatedly tried to kill herself, and each time her pastor told her that her inability to forgive her father was causing her sadness. He also told her that unless she repented, she would eventually succeed in killing herself and would certainly go to hell. With the help of a friend, the woman eventually recognized the cruelty in her pastor's response. Not only did this woman stop seeking her pastor's advice, she found a new church home with a pastor who was sensitive to her pain, was willing to walk through dark valleys with her, and was willing to coordinate his spiritual counseling with the work of her medical and mental health providers. Without this pastor, the woman told me, she would have died. In finding a church sensitive to your needs as an abuse survivor, it may be helpful to ask about a church's child protection policies and the child abuse training received by its called workers. If a church is proactive in training its staff and developing policies to protect children from abuse, they may be sensitive to the needs of adults who abused as children. One survivor told me she had avoided the church for a quarter of a century, until one day she felt God was telling her, "I didn't hurt you, it was evil men who used my name. It's time to come back." She didn't know what to do with this experience, so she ripped from her yellow pages the address of every church in her community. The woman drove to a church and asked the pastor to show her their child protection policy. If the pastor couldn't produce one, she moved on. If the pastor produced a poor policy, she walked away. After visiting more than 20 churches, she finally met a pastor who told her the church developed their policy working with local child protection professionals and that the policy was accompanied by annual training for all their workers. The church had reported cases of abuse, the pastor had preached against the sin of abuse, and the church was involved with community child abuse prevention programs. This was the church the woman chose, the church she found most welcoming to children who are hurting. Once you have found a church sensitive to the needs of abused children, you may want to inquire as to their sensitivity and abilities in responding to the spiritual needs of adults impacted by abuse. The following questions and suggestions may be helpful. Number 1. Is the pastor familiar with the research on the spiritual impact of child abuse? If not, is the pastor willing to get caught up to speed to better understand and address the needs of survivors? Number 2, is the pastor compassionate in meeting the needs of a survivor abused in the name of religion? In one case, a girl was repeatedly sexually abused while her offender hummed a certain hymn. As a woman, she said she wanted to go to church but was scared she would hear the same hymn, be reminded of the abuse, and lose control of her emotions in front of the congregation. In hearing this, the pastor promised not to play the hymn during services. Churches that display this sort of kindness are best suited to meet the spiritual needs of survivors. Number 3, when admitting convicted sex offenders into a congregation, is the church sensitive to the potential emotional impact on survivors? Recognizing that survivors may struggle with attending services with convicted sex offenders, some churches limit the services offenders can attend and otherwise acts to ease the pain of those who may have been abused. If an offender is in the same congregation with his or her victim, many churches ask the offender to find another place of worship as a fruit of their repentance. Number 4, if need be, will the church work in tandem with your medical and mental health professionals? When a parishioner has cancer, pastors do not typically interfere with a doctor's medical treatment. When, however, the parishioner is a child abuse victim, some survivors have encountered pastors who question their medical and mental health treatment. One survivor, for example, told me her pastor instructed her not to take her medication for depression, telling her that only God could heal her mental illness. The victim listened to her pastor and shortly thereafter attempted suicide. She eventually found a pastor willing to work with her medical and mental health team and not against them. There is a growing body of evidence that when faith leaders work with medical and mental health professionals, a victim is more likely to recover physically, emotionally, and spiritually. This is the sort of church survivors should seek. So I just want to walk you a little bit through what my experience has been these last several years. And I'm putting this out on YouTube more so to reach strangers, if that makes sense. Because, like, this is a very real thing. And I say strangers, like, I'm not putting this out there to hurt anyone personally, such as, like, the church that I have left. So, we attended this church for 15 years. It is a wonderful, wonderful church. So loving, so authentic. And it was at this church that I was finally comfortable enough to kind of put myself out there and be like, hey, these are the things I'm struggling with. Can you help me? You know, when you struggle with any kind of addiction, let alone a porn addiction, there's so much shame heaped on that. And the leadership at this church just covered me in love and support. And we spent probably like the next 2 years, you know, in prayer and just trying to figure out how to find healing and asking God, like, how to find healing and what was at the root of this kind of thing. So while I was embraced, you know, with love, there was no answers to be found. And I continued to struggle, you know, just as badly. And then it wasn't until I had found, you know, professionals that specialized in not only like the sexual addiction, but like the trauma and the abuse. And the answers were almost, like, healing wasn't found immediately, but the answers were pretty immediate. Again, because these professionals, like, they've just devoted their lives to understanding the science behind the brain, and how trauma affects the brain and how we react to it. So like just meeting with them, I'm like, oh, like everything was clicking as to what the root was and the trauma. Like I had never healed from my trauma and my abandonment issues. And that healing journey just started to snowball very quickly. And I came back from that experience and I was so excited to share that, with the people that I had journeyed with at that church. But I don't think it came off well, because it was more or less me saying, hey, you know, what you offered me didn't work, which was true. And I realized that there's so many people out there, you know, it's not just me, there's so many people out there that have this unresolved and unhealed trauma. And they don't know what to do with it. They don't even realize the havoc that it's causing. And anyway, I wanted to be an asset. You know, this is what I learned, and it wasn't accepted well. It was just me telling them everything that were doing wrong. I don't know. It was, again, don't want to get into that too much, but now I'm seeing like how very, very, very important it is that if you're meeting with like mental health professionals, that can't be like a separate thing from like your church life. It all has to be on the same page. Does that make sense? For at least the last year, maybe year and a half, you know, we've been still trying to find another church. We've been attending this church we're at now, maybe 6 months now, and there's just so much fear inside of me. Like, I'm afraid to fully commit just because I'm coming out of this other one with so much hurt and confusion. I mean, it can be a really tough thing. One survivor told me she decided to find a church home when she realized how much Jesus was on her side and the side of every child who suffers. This survivor reminded me that Jesus was the descendant of a sexually exploited woman and was frequently seen in the company of other sexually exploited women as he promised not only his help but the very kingdom of God. She went on to say she found comfort in praying to a God who was himself beaten, mocked, and stripped of his clothes. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "God comes to people who have nothing but room for God, and this hollow space, this emptiness in people, is called in Christian speech faith. The same God who fills our emptiness with faith, who stands with survivors in the darkest corners, has also walked with survivors in the long road back to the company of believers." If you are ready to make this journey, I pray this article will help you in taking the next step. Whew. Again, this is one of those articles, like I wish I would have seen this several years ago when that struggle first started with just not understanding like that clash, and for fighting it for so long. Like I really wanted to stay there. Like for 15 years we went there, and I love the people and the friends that I have there. But when it just came down to it, I don't know, they just didn't want to hear what I had learned and what I had found to be effective and what I wanted to share with others. So that's just, as much as I wanted that to continue to be the church for me, like it can't. So I do have high hopes for the next one, but these questions definitely help me to know maybe what to ask or what conversations to have, just to be like, you know, is this going to be a good fit for me? So I hope that was helpful for you. I know when I read this, I'm like, oh, this is so good. I'll link everything down below, like I said. But thanks for joining me today for this. If you're listening to this, you've probably been on a rough journey, and I pray for peace over your day and all the days after that. But thanks for joining me for this. Bye.